Okay, we are continuing our study of the kings of Judah, and our focus has been looking at what Israel wanted in a king, what they got, and then comparing those kings to our King Jesus. And so I want to look at a specific event in King Solomon's life that we'll find in 1 Kings chapter 3. So that'll be our text today. And I want to see how that exemplifies how he judged Israel. And then look at Jesus, our righteous judge, and then just because it was a good example, I thought I'm going to have an example of Paul. So just a very quick review. For about 400 years after leaving Egypt, or after God brought them out of Egypt, God chose judges to lead Israel. But eventually, Israel demanded a king. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 20, why did they want a king?
Everybody else had one.
Everybody else had one. Yeah, fight their battles for them and also to judge them. Okay. So first we looked at the first king, Saul. He was actually from the tribe of Benjamin. So when God said, I'm taking the kingship away from you because Saul failed to obey God and consequently failed as Israel's king. And when God said, I'm taking the kingdom away from you, he took it out of the tribe of Benjamin and put it in the tribe of Judah. The second king from the tribe of Judah was King David. We're familiar with King David. A lot of stories about King David, Goliath. He wrote many of the Psalms. But as soon as David was confirmed as king, and he's confident that, okay, I am king, because there was a lot that went on for at least 7 years that was just a mess trying to get to the next king. And as soon as he was king, the Philistines invaded. And they invaded Israel. Now, David knew where the enemy was. He was ready for the enemy. He had his army ready. He was a fighting man. And yet he stopped and he prayed and he waited for God. And God gave David victory over his enemies. And so today we're looking at the third king of Israel, Solomon, David's son. So what do we know about Solomon? Very wise. What else do we know about Solomon? He was also foolish. Okay.
He had all that.
A lot of
When he got
lies.
all those, he
I
was
think it was like
wise to mess him up.
he definitely had a weakness. It was actually the same weakness as his father, women, but he was a philosopher. He wrote many proverbs. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 32 says he wrote 3,000 proverbs and over 1,000 songs. So he's a philosopher. If you read through the proverbs, it's very wise sayings.
He was a naturalist too. So if y'all knew about nature.
Yeah.
All wisdom. Wisdom.
He was but
Actually, he displayed a great deal of wisdom in that he had a lot going for him, but he prayed for wisdom from God, and I've always admired that. I thought that is, in fact, if that is not the most important thing that we need, besides the blood of Christ, of course, but
James chapter 1, I think verse 5 says, if you lack wisdom, pray for it and God will give it to you.
that's right.
But God will give us opportunities to practice wisdom, I think, because I know he does that with patience. But that's, he was a builder and an architect. He built the first temple, and it was apparently an amazing thing before it was destroyed a couple hundred years later.
But to see it.
I know, but apparently it was. But the description of it is amazing. In 1 Kings chapter 6, he built his own palace. I think it took like 12 or 13 years to build his palace. So he was. I mean, these were very grandiose places. He built the fortifications for Jerusalem. I mean, the walled cities, so that they would be protected. And he did that in a number of different cities. I was reading in an architectural article that said that there are several places that they've unearthed that are very similar to the gate that Solomon built. And so they're saying, we can kind of trace several places where, there's evidence that Solomon built up these fortifications. He built a fleet of ships, according to 1 Kings chapter 9. He was a very skilled political leader. Now, his father was a very successful warrior and kind of defeated all his enemies with the blessings of God. Solomon inherited that kingdom. Now, what happens when a family builds up, a father builds up a business, and then the kids inherit it? Often they just mess it up. I mean, we've seen that a lot of times. But Solomon inherited this kingdom and he maintained it through his diplomacy. He maintained that formidable army. He married many wives, as we have mentioned, but of course, that was also a weakness. Any other comments about what we know about Solomon? He was pretty amazing. Okay, let's go ahead and get into the event in 1 Kings chapter 3. Let's read verses 3 to 5, please.
And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask, what shall I give you?"
Okay, thank you. All right, so God speaks to Solomon in a dream and he says, ask whatever you want. Cool. I mean, this is a young man. It's kind of like there's all kinds of things he could ask for. Yes.
Okay, what is this about sacrifice and burnt incense at the high place?
They didn't have a temple. And so the idea there was, let's go up high, let's get closer to God. And so they were, because there was not a temple, they had the tabernacle still, and it was, I forget exactly which town it was in at that point. It may have actually been in Gibeon, but they had, yeah, in verse 3, 1 Kings 3, verse 3, that they sacrificed up there. Yeah. There was no temple at that time to make sacrifices, and they were still obeying God and making sacrifices to God.
The higher you are, the closer to God you are.
Yeah.
In their mind.
That's what the assumption is why they went to the high places. So, and it may have just been people didn't live up there, and so they went up there as a place where they could build an altar to God.
So they would be away from
Yes.
where they lived. It would be
Yeah.
putting those things.
Make it, yes, make it special, make it a separate place. So it might not be, and people kind of assume that it was because they thought they were closer to God. It may have just been, no one's living here. We can set aside this place as a place to worship God because there wasn't a temple. Okay, let's go ahead and read verses 6 to 9, please.
And Solomon said, you've shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with you. For you have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is to this day. Now, O Lord, my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I'm a little child. I do not know how to go out or to come in, and your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?
Thank you. All right, so we have Solomon's prayer here, and there's 3 parts to this prayer. First, he praised God, and that's always a good way to start a prayer. Instead of with the I wants, start with a praise to God. I say the I wants because that's what Sarah got when she was like 2 years old. She got the I wants. It's kind of like, but sometimes I feel like that's how I approach God with the I wants. But Solomon starts with praise. That's a good way to start. Secondly, he has clearly done some self-examination and is honest about his inadequacies, what he feels that he is unable to do. I mean, he's king now, and he's got the responsibility. He has seen how, saw how his father led. By the time Solomon was born, because Solomon was far from the firstborn, and that's a whole other, there was a lot that went into that. But so David would have been well established as king, probably a much older man when he had Solomon. So Solomon would have seen David, who knew how to be king by that point. And so it's kind of, how do I get there? I'm just starting off.
But Solomon said he's young. About how old was he?
No idea. A young man at that age could be anywhere from like 20s to 30 or mid 30s or something like that. So, but he feels
Feels
He,
like
he feels,
doesn't
he is,
understand.
when he calls himself a little child, he's young and inexperienced is what he's referring to. And to me, yeah, 30 years old right now would be very, very, very young, but even mid-30s. Yes, he is a novice. He has not done this before. He's got all these advisors, so he has like all these voices telling him, well, you should do this, you should do that. And so he refers to himself as a little child. He's young and inexperienced. He's not done this before. And he uses a very interesting phrase. He doesn't know how to go out or to come in. And it's a phrase that's used several times in the Bible to mean lead the people. In Numbers 27, verse 17, Moses asked God to appoint a new leader who will go out and come in before Israel. It's used in 1 Samuel 18, verse 13 to describe David and how he led the King Saul's army, that he went out before them and came in.
That scripture right there.
1 Samuel 18, verse 13. And it's a phrase that means to lead. And I got to thinking about how, God refers to leaders of Israel as shepherds. Well, my understanding, I've never been around sheep very much, but my understanding is you have to lead them. I grew up in the summers helping my granddad with cattle, and you herd them, you push them, but that's not what you do as sheep. And so the idea here is someone who leads, who goes out first and then comes back in and leads the people around. And then verse 8, Solomon has just been reflecting on what it meant to be king. He is responsible for judging right and wrong for an entire nation. That would be overwhelming, especially, like I said, you've got all these advisors, you've got other people saying, well, it should be done this way, and this guy, no, it should be done this way, and you have all these people saying these things. Who do you listen to? What's going on? How do you figure out what's going on? That's a lot of responsibility, and it sounds like he's feeling a bit overwhelmed because David, who did it so well for like 40 years, he's gone now, and then it's Solomon's turn.
But the other thing is, it's like, he did so great, and what am I don't feel adequate enough.
Because he's brand new, because he would have seen his father as already established as king, already knowing what to do and all that.
He was smart enough to ask for the right thing.
Yes, he was. So third part of this prayer, Solomon makes his request, and he asks for understanding in verse 9, which the word I understand means hearing, that idea of being able to comprehend. And so many times, I mean, if you watch people, even on the news, talking to each other, it's kind of like, you're not actually hearing what that other person is saying. You're so busy thinking about what you're going to say, or you're listening, you're hearing it, you're just somehow not hearing. And hearing is a very important thing, to be able to comprehend what someone is saying to you. And sometimes Sam will say something, I'm kind of like, could you restate that? I'm not sure I got that. But again, the idea of comprehending, it's a rare gift to hear, to listen. And so what Solomon is wanting is the ability to discern, to be able to identify the distinct difference between right and wrong. And he also needs the courage to follow through. Because again, if you've got a wealthy man who comes in and then a poor guy, and they're at odds and they need someone to judge between them, and the wealthy guy says, hey, I support you and I've got money. I mean, Solomon has to be able to say, I'm going to see what's right, regardless of who says it. I'm going to do what's right, regardless of what this advisor says. I mean, who knows how many dozens of advisors that he had. And we know that eventually he started listening to all of these wives and not making the right decision. That happens. But again, he wants the ability to stand firm on what's right. Any other comments on this
Not be
section?
a respecter of person.
Yes, to judge correctly.
It's interesting to me that God chooses people, some who are very weak in character. However, even those who are so great in our minds, God points out some weaknesses in them. And that's a lesson for us, that God will take care of our weaknesses. So we need not beat ourselves up about our weaknesses.
There's also no
God
excuse. Yeah.
restrained.
There's also no excuse not to do something. Oh, I might fail. Well, look at all the failures we have as examples.
Exactly.
Try it anyway if you're in that position. Okay, anybody else?
The only failure is one that doesn't try at all.
Exactly.
That's right.
All right, and that's actually a perfectionist, is one who just, you can't try because you want everything to be perfect, and sometimes it keeps you from doing anything. But anyway, that's totally off topic. All right, verses 10 to 14, please.
The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. Then God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, I have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. Behold, I have accordingly to your words, see, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so there has not been anyone like you before, nor shall anyone like you arise after you. And I have also given you, and you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that you shall not be like anyone like you, you among the king of all your days. So if you walk in my ways, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days.
Thank you. All right.
If you walk in my way.
Yes,
Uh-huh.
absolutely. All right, so God was pleased with what Solomon asked for and with what he did not ask for. Because, and it just struck me that he says that you have not asked for the life of your enemies. Being king, you've got a lot of enemies. In fact, the first chapter of First Kings, David lists, David is old and he knows he's about to die, and he goes through a list of, here are your enemies. You need to deal with these people. And so leaders have enemies. I don't care if you're leading 2 or 3 people, or if you're leading a whole nation, you have a target on your back. So, but God is very pleased with what Solomon asked for and what he did not ask for. Solomon's request showed the focus of his heart. It wasn't on himself, it was on the people. It's kind of like, I need to meet these people's needs. I need to be able to judge them, to be able to lead them. He had a responsibility, and he took that responsibility seriously. Not just, hey, I'm king now, it's party time. That's what we read in Esther. It's kind of like, let's have a 6-month party. I think that's how long it lasted in Esther. So he knew that this job is bigger than me, and I have to rely on God. I mean, that's an attitude that we can all have. This job is, life is bigger than me. I need to rely on God. And so he asked God, and this is the takeaway I want us to see here. He asked God to improve his character, not his circumstances. Saul still had enemies. He still was going to struggle with being the leader. He was still going to have people nattering in his ear on both, on all sides. You should do this, you should do that. He was still going to have all that stuff. His circumstances didn't change. What he asked God to do was improve his character so he could deal with his circumstances.
How do you spell circumstances?
CIRCUMSTANCES. I just write CIR whenever. I don't try to. Fortunately, I have spell correct when I'm typing this stuff. All right, so God promised here to do both. He was going to make him wise and give him all these blessings. And this is the same God. I mean, God wants to bless us. It's, it sometimes seems like, I don't know. I don't really think this, but I've heard people kind of picture God this way, that God very stingy with his blessings. I mean, I've heard people kind of express that. It's kind of, well, maybe God will answer this, and maybe God will bless me. I don't think really God will, is going to notice my needs. No, God wants to bless us. That's the God that we have. All right. Any other comments on the event in?
Many times I think the problem is we want the blessings, but we don't want to do our part. Like here, he says, if you walk in my ways.
Yes. Yeah. And as long as he did, but that was the whole thing. That has been repeated. It's a theme all the way through the Old Testament. I mean, first of all, the Old Testament is pointing to Jesus, because it's pointing to, here's the solution, because you have the mystery. How does God take care of sin and have relationship with people? Because sacrificing animals isn't going to do that if you just think about it a little bit. And so there's a mystery there. How does God reestablish relationship? Well, he's pointing to that all the way through the Old Testament. But the other thing is, constantly, if you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and commandments, I will bless you. And he always says the other too. And if you don't, and actually with Moses, he was very specific. this is what's going to happen. And when you read that, you would think that anybody who had ever heard that would avoid it like crazy, because it's just so, it's some terrible things when God withdraws his protection. Yes, ma'am.
As long as Saul walked in his ways.
Yes, absolutely.
Started trying to do it his own
Mhm.
way, that's when
Yes,
things went
yeah.
downhill.
I mean, Saul had a fantastic son. I wish we knew more about Jonathan.
Yeah.
This was an
I like Jonathan.
amazing person. And so, if he had been able to, if Saul had done the right thing, Israel would have been in great shape with the next king if it had been Jonathan. And Jonathan was so humble that he was willing to just, hey, God has told David, God has made you king. I just want to be there with you. I'll support you. I mean, he was an amazing, amazing
Saul would have
person.
killed David if it wasn't for Jonathan.
Yep.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes. Oh. Okay. So did Israel get what they asked for in King Solomon?
Yeah.
Yeah. They got a king. They want a king to judge them. They got a king to judge them. I would also say kind of, well, you want a good judge. And so I would also say, kind of no, because when he started judging in a bad way, then yeah, that's going to affect everybody. But for the yes part, Israel wanted a king to judge them. A judge has to look at the evidence and decide what is right and wrong. Israel got the wisest judge for that, the one most able to discern right and wrong. I mean, because that's the job of a judge. When you're watching and you're hearing, even today, court cases and all that kind of stuff, it's kind of like, how could that judge decide that? It's kind of like, that's crazy. And well, we don't have all the evidence. The judge supposedly has all the evidence and has made the right decision. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But what Israel got was the wisest king, able to judge like no other. And verse 12 here, 1 Kings 3, God said, there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. You are unique in your ability to judge. And when Solomon judged with God's authority, that is, when he submitted to God's authority and didn't take it on himself and make decisions that, that he thought was right, when he relied on God's judgment, he judged rightly, and God gave him success, just as he had given David success. You're submitting to, I mean, even the king had to submit to God to be blessed by God. And why we think that word submit is a terrible word when, anyway, I'm not going to go, no soapboxes. But again, if Solomon submitted to God, then he was able to judge rightly. That wisdom is illustrated in the last part of chapter 3 here. I'm just going to summarize it for the sake of time, but two women came to Solomon with a problem. Both of them had babies, and one of the babies had died. Both women were claiming the live baby was theirs. Solomon's solution: cut the baby in half, give half to each woman. Now, one woman agreed to that. She said, oh, that's a great idea. And the other one said no. She was willing to give up her son. She wanted her son to live so badly that it's kind of like, I'll give him up right now. Just give him to the other woman. She wanted him to live so badly. Solomon's wisdom made it obvious to everyone which woman was the mother. In fact, 3,000 years later, when we read about this, there is no doubt in our minds as to who the mother was. I mean, if you look back at court cases, you can say, I wonder if they made the right decision. But when you look back at the example of Solomon making a decision, there is no doubt. He didn't just say, oh, I know which one it is. He said, he proved it to everybody.
He let the women through.
Yes, he did. Yes. And it was a very wise, I mean, it sounds, really weird, but it was a very wise way of doing it. And as he promised, God gave him many other blessings. If you turn over to 1 Kings chapter 10, Solomon was rich and famous. First Kings 10 verse 7, the Queen of Sheba came to visit. She tested Solomon with many questions. And in verse 7, she said, you exceed in wisdom and prosperity, the report which I heard. Now she came to visit because she'd heard, hey, there's this guy that's amazing. He can answer any question you have. He's incredible. And she came and it said that she asked all that was in her heart in verse 2. And she said, the reports I heard about you, they are nothing compared to the reality of who you are. in verses 23 and 24. So King Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And all the earth was seeking the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Everybody was coming to see him, and they came with presents. I mean, Israel was made very wealthy under King Solomon. Verse 27 says that he made silver as common as stones in Jerusalem. I mean, this was kind of, I mean, David made Israel the height as far as safety and security and beating back the enemies. I mean, Israel reached the height there. Solomon made them incredibly wealthy. But there were also times when Solomon judged using man's wisdom, when he did not submit to God, specifically with the wives, because it was, I mean, he was told. Moses was told 400 years later, when they demand a king, don't let the king marry a bunch of wives. Okay. I mean, he said that way back in Deuteronomy.
Our downfall.
Well, more than one. You never read of a happy polygamist in the Bible. That just doesn't happen. And he said, but when he followed the wisdom of man, he set himself up for failure. In 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1, he married the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, this was very common. This was considered a very wise thing to do, to marry the daughters of other kings. Because, I mean, it's much less likely that the king was going to attack you if his little girl was your wife. So he married the king of Pharaoh, which was also probably a pretty big coup, because remember, they'd come out of slavery. Just 400 years earlier, they'd come out of slavery from, so I doubt the Egyptians thought much of Israel, and yet Solomon was able to marry Pharaoh's daughter. So that was probably considered, wow, this is a really good thing for a king to be able to do. You've got alliances. Man's wisdom says this is a great idea. You guarantee sons so that, because again, there's a lot that can happen to kids, especially when you don't have modern medicine, guaranteed a successor to the throne. So this was considered a good thing as far as man's wisdom. And in fact, in 1 Kings 9, verse 16, Pharaoh had conquered Gezer and killed its inhabitants as a dowry for his daughter when she married Solomon. Here's your wedding gift. Here's a town. I've wiped out everybody in it. It's empty. It's ready for you to rebuild it and put in there whoever you want to. That was, I mean, and Gezer was a Philistine city. Remember, the Philistines attacked Israel constantly. For the past 400 years, they've been attacking Israel. And this makes one less fortified city of your enemies within your territory. I looked on the little map in the back of my Bible, and it looks like Gezer is only 30 miles from Jerusalem. Now, it's a bit of a hike because most people walked, but still, it seems uncomfortably close for your enemy. And Pharaoh came in and he wiped it all out and said, here, it's a wedding gift. Okay. But again, so conventional wisdom says that was a very smart, very shrewd thing to do, marrying Pharaoh's daughter. But these many wives turned Solomon's heart away from God, just as God had warned through Moses. 1 Kings, did I give this to someone? 1 Kings 11, verse 9 through 11.
So the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you've done this, and have kept my covenant, and have not kept my covenant, and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your son.
All right, thank you. So again, Solomon here, he failed to submit to God's judgment. God said, don't marry a lot of wives, that they'll turn your heart away. Sure enough, it happened just like God had warned. But so this did not only negatively impacted Solomon, whose heart was turned away from God by those wives, and he actually, in chapter 11 here, he when he was old, verse 4, his wives turned his heart away to other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God. He built, he went after Ashtaroth, of Milcom. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He built high places for this other, for Chemosh. Again, he started worshiping idols. So he was probably trying to do both. It's kind of like, on the Sabbath, I'm right there, God. And then Monday, it's kind of like, oh, we're going to go over here and worship. And his failure in submitting to God's judgment negatively impacted him because he wasn't wholly devoted to God, but it also negatively impacted his family because, again, God says, okay, I'm not gonna tear the kingdom away in your lifetime for the sake of David, but in your son, he's gonna have problems. And it impacted the nation of Israel because that's going to lead to civil war. It's going to lead to a lot of problems there. So when I say yes and no on that judging, yes, they got a good judge, but then he just started judging without submitting to God, and he failed as a judge, and it was going to have a very negative impact on Israel going forward. But that's next week. Any other comments about Solomon here?
I read how many wives and other religions.
600, 300, yeah.
I remember, well, they said in one place he had 800 wives.
Maybe 700. Yeah. He's got more than he needed.
Okay, he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines.
Yes.
There we go.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, he was disobeying God, and he was using man's wisdom, not God's wisdom.
Who would disobey?
I know.
Well, it's impossible.
Yeah.
It's an impossible task. I know.
Yeah. All right, we're gonna move on to Jesus now. And Matthew chapter 5 is where we're gonna be. Matthew 5 begins what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Chapter 5. Page 952, if that helps.
It's 13.
All right, Matthew chapter 5. And in this chapter, 6 times Jesus uses this phrase or this pattern, you have heard this commandment, but I say to you. Now, Jesus was not speaking against the law. He was judging rightly that sin begins in the heart.
Where in Matthew chapter 5 are we?
We are not yet.
Okay.
So, and Jesus judged correctly that we must control our minds to be able to control our actions. Now we're in verse 21. This is one example of where he said, you have heard this. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Jesus forbids the kind of anger which will not forget, the anger which refuses to be pacified or calmed down. He forbids the anger that seeks revenge. Okay, so when Jesus made that judgment, he says, if you have that kind of anger in your heart, that is going to lead to something bad at some point. I mean, maybe not immediately, maybe you can just stay angry for a long time, but sooner or later, that kind of anger comes out. It comes out in harsh words. It comes out in action. It comes out in harm. We see that example with Cain. Because again, Cain was angry with his brother. God warned him about that anger that was in his heart. And we don't know how long a time between the time that Cain was first angry with Abel to the time that Cain rose up and just killed him. He was just so overcome by that anger in his heart that it led to action. And so Jesus has judged that that kind of anger, the kind that you just hang on to, that you won't let go of, that you just stew in, will cause harm. Not only harm to another person, it causes ourselves harm. Blood pressure and all that kind of stuff. It make you sick. So Jesus has judged that. And so when he says, you've heard this, but I say, he is making a judgment that if you have these things in your heart, they will lead to sinful actions. They will lead to harmful actions.
Well, medicine tells us, doctors tell us that anger will cause many problems, physical problems.
Yes.
Psalm
But-
37 talks about that.
Not fretting.
Yeah. Yes. And again, so what Jesus is seeing here specifically when he says, this is what you've heard, but I say to you, he's saying, what you've got in your heart will lead to sin. And that's what Jesus wants us to avoid. He said, all these, your circumstances, whatever caused the anger, sorry, but don't let that anger, even if it's righteous anger or, whatever, don't let that anger lead to sin. Even if someone harms you, don't let that anger lead to sin, because then that's on you. What they've done is on them until you keep that anger in your heart so long that you sin. And that's where Jesus is coming out. And he has judged whatever is in your heart is going to come out eventually. And so he goes on to give many more commands in this sermon. When you read through the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, I say to you, you've heard this, but I say, 6 times in just chapter 5, he says, you've heard this, but I say, because he's addressing the heart. He's addressing the root cause of sin. So Jesus has judged what is right and what is wrong from his own authority. And at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7, verse 28, it says that the multitudes were amazed at his teaching, for he taught as one having authority. Because he does. Okay. Jesus' authority to judge is his by right as creator and God. Did I give someone John chapter 1, verse 1-3?
Yes. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.
Thank you. All right. In John chapter 10, verse 30, he says, I and the Father are one. And people knew exactly what he meant by that because they picked up rocks to kill him. Because he said, why are you doing that? He says, because you've made yourself equal with God. Well, he made a true statement. He is equal with God. Matthew 28, verse 18, Jesus says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. I really like Philippians chapter 2, but it's one that's hard for me to get my brain around sometimes, because Philippians chapter 2 is about Jesus giving up all that he had, how he had to empty himself to somehow fit into a human body. And but he gave up all he had in heaven, who he was, and he submitted to dying for you and for me because he judged that that was the right thing to do. It's the whole chapter really, but I can go, let's see, Philippians 2, verse 6, or starting in verse 5, have this attitude in yourselves. Again, going back to the attitude, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a bondservant, and humbled himself to dying. That's it's Philippians 2, verse 5 to about verse 8.
But yes, through 8.
So our judge, Jesus, was willing to give up all that he already had by right. I mean, he's God in heaven, part of that Godhead in heaven. He gave up all that he had to live like us so that he could understand us. We know that from Hebrews chapter 4. And then to die for us. I mean, we can trust that judge. He knows what it's like to be us. He loved us so much that he was willing to live like us so that he could understand us. And he is judge, and we can trust him. That's the thing. We don't have to be afraid of judgment. We can stand confidently. Hebrews also says we can stand confidently before the throne of God. And that's an amazing thing to be able to do. That all the people that were studying through the Old Testament, they didn't have that. They didn't know what that was. We have it. The Bible is like a mystery book. And we have the solution to the mystery. But if we only study the last part of it, then it's like we've missed the whole lead up to the big reveal. Okay. And that's why I think it's so important, or one of the reasons it's important to study the Old Testament, is that this is an amazing thing that Jesus has done for us. And so when he's our judge, it's kind of like, okay, I trust that because he knows and he wants to help us and he did all that for us.
And he was tempted.
Yeah.
Everything that we're tempted.
Mhm. So he
And that-
understands.
I have trouble understanding, well, I don't understand. that.
Yeah. It's another one of those, it's kind of like God was able to squeeze into human form somehow or other. He had to leave a lot of himself in heaven. And, that's what Philippians 2 said. And I don't, it's hard to understand, but he did that for us, for love of us. And it's amazing. But that's the judge that we have. Any other comments here? Or I have one more point in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We'll talk about Paul just a little bit. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 8, Paul talks about this thorn in the flesh. And he prays and it says here that 3 times he prayed that God would take it away. Verse 8 says, concerning this thorn in the flesh, I entreated the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. Whatever that was, I have no idea. But man's wisdom would say that Paul would be a more effective preacher without whatever infirmity that this was. And Paul probably thought that too. That's why he asked 3 times. It's kind of, God, if this wasn't holding me back, whether it was his vision or something left over from all the many beatings that he took, I mean, that would cause some permanent damage too. Whatever it was, Paul probably thought too, hey, I'd be much more effective if I didn't have this slowing me down. And we probably think that too, God, I would be much more effective, much more able if this wasn't slowing me down. And so but that's man's wisdom. If I was 100%, boy, I could do things for God. Okay. That was actually in Genesis chapter 2, that was Moses' idea. Moses is 40 years old at that point. He's ready to lead Israel. God, I've got this. I am able, I'm ready to go. God says, you need some time. You need to percolate a little bit longer. And so 40 years later, when Moses had a humble attitude of, God, I don't think I can do this, then God says, now I can use you. Okay. But again, man's wisdom says, of course, Moses was the leader at 40 years old. He was physically fit. I mean, he all of this, but no, God's wisdom says you need to be able to rely on me and to submit to God to be able to be effective for God.
Perhaps that thorn in the flesh was to keep him humble.
Well, that's what he says in verse 7. Says that that because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, because Paul was shown a lot. To keep him from exalting himself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh. Okay, whatever that was. But again, he's looking at that and probably thinking too, hey, I could be more effective. But God answered in verse 9 that his grace was sufficient, for power is perfected in weakness. Now that doesn't make any sense to me as far as if I'm going to be judging something. It's kind of like if I'm looking at a young man in his prime, ready to go. Sure, I think he's more effective for God than Paul, who's broken down, beaten up. But again, that's man's wisdom. God's wisdom says the one who's willing to submit to me, the one that is willing to submit to God in humility is the one that God can use. Relying on our character, not our circumstances. And so,
You mentioned Genesis 2.
Exodus 2, sorry, Exodus 2. My apologies, yes. Thank you very much. Exodus chapter 2 is where Moses is, it comes onto the scene. Thank you very much. That would throw.
Fire, blessed on the meek.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So we have Paul's response when God says, no, I'm not going to take away this thorn in the flesh. I mean, I could see other people look at Paul as like, Paul, you can heal other people. Why can't you heal yourself? And Paul's like, well, God said no. and again, but Paul's response in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 10 says, therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul submitted to God's judgment that his character was more important than his circumstances. Just like Solomon, who wanted God to help his character, not control his circumstances, because, I mean, circumstances are crazy. I mean, we all know that. Going through life, your circumstances change, they get harder, they get a little easier, they go back to harder. Circumstances are nuts, okay? But our character is what will keep us close to God. Yes.
Even Christ at the very end in the garden, he said, I just brought this up. He said, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will.
Mhm.
So, even
Yep.
Christ.
Absolutely. But God, go ahead.
That verse you're talking about, verse 8, 9, actually on the paper you have verse 10. Verse 10 is very important too.
Yes.
So why don't you?
Yeah, I think I read that one that
Did
that he
you?
is, yeah, that he is well content with weaknesses, because when I am weak, I am
Yes.
strong.
Okay, I missed it.
But again, Paul decided that his circumstances weren't what's important. Because he was going to obey God regardless of his circumstances, what was important. And God had judged, I mean, we have to learn this. God has already judged that our character, what's in our heart, is more important than our circumstances. It seems like we have to learn that. I have to learn it every day sometimes, but again, but God's judgment has already, we just see all the way through that our character, what's in our hearts, is more important than our circumstances.
What Jesus was teaching.
Yes, because our circumstances just, I mean, they'll change tomorrow. And eventually our circumstances won't matter because our life is a vapor, and then we'll be with God. Any other comments before we finish up here? Okay, when we make judgments submitting to God's authority, we can know that those decisions will be correct. When we make judgments based on man's wisdom, we can be pretty sure that we've made a dumb decision and we're going to step in it up to our hip waders. God has blessed us with all the knowledge that we need to be able to make good judgments, to know what is right and what is wrong. 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, all scripture has been, and it goes through the benefit of scripture so that we can know what we need to do. We've got it right here. I carry it around on my phone. I mean, it's so convenient for us. And just like Paul, sometimes we pray for God to change our circumstances, and there's nothing wrong with that. Okay. But when God says no, it's kind of like I need to have the attitude of Paul and say, okay, God has judged that my circumstances don't need to change. Suck it up, buttercup, and move on. I know that there's certainly, because, and that's fine. Paul prayed 3 times that his circumstances would change, and that's good. But when God said no, he accepted it. And he said, okay, God's made a judgment here. And we don't speak for God, obviously. But if we're praying for something to change, and instead we're getting a chance to learn and grow, and other people are looking at our example, okay, maybe my focus needs to be more on the internal instead of the external.
We need to be careful about what we pray for, because if we continue and make up our minds that that's what we need, God takes care of that also. He will tell us in 2 Thessalonians tells us that if we continue, he will send strong delusions that we can believe a lie.
Yeah.
And that's scary.
Yes. And again, submitting to, what judgment are we going to submit to? Are we going to submit to man's wisdom and say, okay, this is how things should be, and all, or are we going to submit to God's wisdom and say, okay, that's what I'm going to use to make the judgments in my life. That's what I'm going to use to decide how to approach my circumstances, what attitudes to have. We need to submit to God's judgment that our character is more important than our circumstances. And I'm the last one to say something like that, because doggone it, I like my circumstances to be, I want this or I want that different, because circumstances are important too. But again,
If only if it were this way.
I know.
Why?
I know. If people just listen to me, everything would just be fine. Yeah. All right. But again, what's in our hearts controls whether or not we sin. And that's, that's the judgment that Jesus has said. Yeah. I want to finish with 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21. Use your judgment and hold on to whatever is really good. Steer clear of evil in any form. Thank you very much for your time and for your comments.